So, we are in the third week of Advent in our sacred gathering, and for Advent, what we've been doing is looking at kind of the different characters that show up in that like classic cradle scene you see on postcards and in so many churches. So, the first week we looked at kind of the holy parents, Joseph and Mary, and kind of who they were and what some of their significance might be, and the way God is choosing to work. Last week we looked at the angels and the shepherds who were sent as messengers both to the Holy Family and to represent, I think, kind of the lowliness, the outsider aspect of what God is doing in the Christmas story. This week, we are going to look at the Magi or the three kings or the wise men, however you're used to saying that. Despite the fact that historically they were not actually there at the manger, but for easy representation, they tend to show up in a lot of manger scenes. So we're going to look at who exactly these guys were, why the Gospel of Matthew feels the need to mention their visit, and what the significance of that is. So as we've been going through kind of with each of these, the reminder is the Gospels are told in a certain way, right? They had immense amounts of material probably to work through, and they tell the story emphasizing certain things. And one of the things that Matthew is working on is the fact that he is transitioning from this kind of Old Testament mentality, but also just the anticipation. The Matthew particularly points out not just the connections to the Old Testament, but the fact that God has been working towards this, that Jesus' birth is a culmination of human history, that this is something that God has been predicting and preparing his people for a long time, and pointing out the fact that these magi came and visited Jesus when he was very young culminates and fits a lot of themes and a lot of things he's been working with for quite a while. They also represent well another of Matthew's important things, and that's just the inclusion of Gentiles into God's family. It's an interesting contrast in a lot of ways. Matthew is the most Jewish of the Gospels. In it, Jesus is almost always portrayed as kind of a traditional rabbi. He's very aware of issues of cleanliness, of cultural things, of, again, the anticipation of who this Messiah was and the law. And yet, because I think he has such a strong sense of his own Jewish identity, he, I think, in some ways recognizes the wonder of the fact that God is extending his relationship with the Israelite people to Gentiles themselves. Maybe some of the Gentiles don't realize the profundity of this and how stretching this was to the Jewish mentality in which they thought they were special and set apart, right? And yet, even in the Old Testament, we see again and again they were special and set apart as a bridge between God and the rest of the world, as priests, a nation of priests, as an example, that sort of thing. And so I think Matthew is going to tell us about the Magi to point out this theme again as well. So let's kind of read this often very familiar story coming out of Matthew chapter 2 about the coming of the Magi. So after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in the territory of Judea during the rule of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem. Excuse me. They asked, "Where is the newborn king of the Jews? We've seen his star in the east, and we've come to honor him." When King Herod heard this, he was troubled, and everyone in Jerusalem was troubled with him. He gathered all the chief priests and the legal experts and asked them where the Christ was to be born. And they said, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what the prophet wrote," quoting Micah and Samuel. "You, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, because from you will come one who governs and who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and found out from them the time when the star had first appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search carefully for the child. When you found him, report to me, so that I too may go and honor him." When they heard the king, they went, and look, the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with Mary his mother, and falling to their knees they honored him. When they opened their treasure chests and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Because they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they went back to their own country by another route. So first, let's talk about the star. What cosmological phenomenon was going on here? There's been a lot of theories. People have looked at old star charts. They've guessed. Some people have thought it was maybe Halley's comet, though based on the timing, it wasn't quite right. Some people think maybe it's a special supernova that we're not aware of. A lot of people think that it was not, literally a star because everyone knew this. But a conjunction of the planets. And I think this theory is particularly interesting. I hadn't run into this one before this week because, particularly, all of the planets, whose, of course, motions in the ancient world they knew really well, had kind of certain associations with them, right? And there was, around this time, we know, a very bright conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn. And this may have been fitting particularly because Jupiter was associated in those days with royalty, with kings, right? With emperors. And Saturn itself was associated with the West, which is, of course, they're coming from Persia from the East. The Magi are going to associate with the West, or very specifically with the Jewish people, this people who've lived for a long time at kind of the crossroads of all these civilizations. And so, if it was in fact a conjunction between these two planets with the associations, right, the king and this planet associated with the Jews, you can see why they might show up saying, hey, we saw this conjunction, we saw this thing that is now appearing to be a star, and we know it has something to do with the king of the Jews. So, again, we don't know. This is reading between the lines, but I hadn't heard that one before. I thought it was kind of an interesting. It was kind of an interesting take on where this star actually comes from. Interestingly, we actually have other extra biblical sources of about this conjunction and this assumption as well. We have writers both in Rome and down in Egypt, so both very different cultures, very difficult distance away, and yet both saw this phenomenon of this conjunction, and both of them wrote about the expectation in Egypt and in Rome about some kind of a king or an emperor coming from the Jewish people. So fascinating that the world and the astrology world saw the significance of this, and that they had been kind of watching and waiting. But it's these specific magi who actually take off. So from the Jewish perspective, this star and that language specifically is a strong messianic hope and understanding. So there's a prophecy quoted all the way back in Numbers chapter 24. Again, interestingly, from the lips of not one of the prophets, but the pagan prophet, Balaam, who's kind of more of a witch doctor, right? So again, we have an outsider, a non-Jewish person making this prediction about God's people. And as he looks over the mass of the people, he has this prophecy. I see him, but not now. I look at him, but not nearby. A star comes from Jacob. A scepter rises from Israel, smashing Moab's forehead and at the head of the Sethites. Someone from Jacob will rule and destroy all the survivors from these various countries that he mentions afterwards. And so this was recognized by the Jewish people as a sign of the Messiah, of this coming promised king that people were excited about. And so it's interesting that this association was so strong, because we know that there were tons and tons of people trying to be political messiahs that were trying to free their people at that time. It was kind of Messiah fever in the season. And so we actually even know one of the failed revolutionaries took the nickname of the Bar Kokhba, or the son of the star. He even tried to mint his own coins that had a big star on them. Again, because of this prophecy saying, I am the prophesied one, I'm the one you're waiting for. So we get in this world that is going to see a strong connection and meaning between what we would consider natural phenomenon, right? We have this kind of mechanistic that things go on in their own, have their, God has put the physics in place, and stars and those things are all kind of doing their own thing in a lot of ways, right? Yet in the ancient world, they would have had more of what's called a cosmological worldview. All things are connected, all things have significance on one another back and forth. And so we see a world that is desperately watching and anticipating something that has happened because of this star, whether it's from kind of the pagan perspective, just noticing this conjunction or this bright thing showing up in the sky and associating it with a king of the Jews for some reason. What does this mean? What is this person going to be? Or if it's from the Jewish perspective, recognizing this is a sign of Messiah. This star is going to be a sign that God is on the move and he's bringing this promised king for a long time. And so Jesus is born into a world that is desperately looking for him. In some ways, though, as we'll see throughout the Gospel of Matthew, he's going to be a very different kind of king than everyone was anticipating. So let's talk real quickly about the Magi. Again, you've probably heard this in other better sermons, but kind of for a quick review, Magi is the word that's actually magioi or something like that, is what's used in the Bible. It's the same root we get our word magician and magic from, so people who would have done that. It wasn't very closely defined back in the day, so they also would have been, omen readers. They would have been dream interpreters. They would have been doing magic. They would have been doing astrology. They would have been doing astronomy and physical sciences. So they would have been kind of alchemists and scientists, magicians in this point in the world. These things are still very interconnected. We haven't separated them out. And they're still approaching in the same way. So we don't know if they're Persian, if they're Babylonian. They may be priests from like Persia. They had kind of a priestly class of these. They may have been traditional Babylonian astronomers. We don't totally know who these guys were, but Matthew points out that they're coming, and they're coming with these gifts as kind of an anticipation of something that is, again, with his theme of culmination, anticipation of. There are many prophecies in the Old Testament, particularly from Isaiah, in which pagan, non-Jewish kingdoms will bring their absolute best, that all will be gathered into kind of this temple, that there will only be one kingdom someday. And so this idea of these pagan kings or these pagan intellectuals, of these pagan, you know, magicians, whatever we want to call them, coming and bringing these royal gifts, bringing gifts from their society, bringing gifts from their culture to bow down to God and to the king, is something that had been anticipated and believed. This was considered one of the signs of the end of the world, when there won't be wars, when there won't be different separated countries, when all of humanity will again be unified in its worship. There are a lot of traditions that have kind of built up around these guys. So, one, we've obviously got the three kings. So a lot of people will show them as, three separate individuals because of the three gifts. But we don't know. There could have been like 40 of these guys. Just put in, a pair of these guys. We don't really know. The Bible doesn't tell us. And in traditional art, it has kind of come to let them represent kind of all of humanity. So yeah, these guys, in some art, they have specific names. They're considered the kings of specific countries. But they're almost always represented as coming from three different races. So there's usually someone of kind of African origin, someone who's black. There's usually someone who's kind of Middle Eastern looking, and there's usually someone who's kind of Asian looking, who would have been kind of the Orient. And back in the day, there's usually someone who's young, someone who's middle-aged, someone who's old. Again, they are supposed to represent all of the kind of non-Jewish world at the time. And again, I found it kind of amusing, just based on the just kind of racism that shows up in a lot of Western culture and a lot of Western art the last couple hundred years, that for most of human history, if these three wise men, these magi that have been chosen to represent all of humanity, the one race that never made it was white people. Because at the time, white people were considered barbarians. They weren't actually considered fully people, so we don't need to represent them. Kind of a funny historical irony, since, in so much art nowadays, Jesus himself is apparently white. But yeah, I just thought it was kind of amusing that in these historical representations of all of humanity, the white people didn't make it, because we're not actually people. barbarians or monkeys, I guess. Um, anyway, it's a bit of a side note. Um, the interesting other thing is they represent the entire world, right? So this is the outsiders, the outside world. So whereas Luke wants to emphasize in the shepherds the outsiders as those who are least, who are outside of society in the sense of being too poor or being too rough. Um, Matthew is going to emphasize people who are outside kind of the Jewish culture and the Jewish religion, and they come representing all peoples as bringing gifts, as desiring to be near God, even though He isn't there. And this section also does a lot of one of Matthew's favorite things, and that is irony. This section is just dripping in irony. So the first thing that we're going to see here is the Magi come, they offer these gifts, and it's, the word that they use is bow down, is how we often translate it, but it's the same root as worship. They, as you know, non-Jewish people are not going to have a problem thinking of him as a divine or demi divine, you know, a demigod sort of a thing. They don't have a problem mixing his humanness and his divineness in some ways. And so for them, it's not a big deal to come and worship someone who may be human, may be divine, mixed, right? And their insight that this king isn't just a political ruler, but one that has a divine aspect, that one that is in fact worthy of worship, was they were led to through a very different route, right? They were led to through the route of astrology and magic, and yet they have had an insight of who this person is, that he is worthy of worship, that the other characters in the story, those who are Jewish, who are supposed to understand who this is, are missing. And so we look at some of the other characters in this story, right? Those who are supposed to get it. The scholars and priests are with King Herod, disturbed because they recognize the Messiah might be messing things up. They've gotten a bit complacent. And I think this passage is one that does not paint them in a very positive light, right? The priestly class, the scholarly class, those who are the leaders and the religious leaders of the Jewish people, they know full well who Herod is, and they probably have a pretty good guess on what his motivation. And yet, when he calls them, they're willing to provide information to him, saying, saying, well, this is where the Messiah is supposed to be. And so Herod starts seeking out information. So again, there's this irony of these outsiders, these non-Jewish people who are there worshiping and seeking out God, when the people who were, as an entire culture, prepared and ready, aren't either seeking him out and aren't that excited about the fact that the Messiah might be among them. And then I think in a really important portion of this section is recognizing Herod. So Herod historically is in a bit of an awkward position because he's not even fully Jewish. He married into the royal family. If there's one thing he cannot claim, it's to be a true Messiah. He cannot claim to be someone who has come up from David's time. And as someone who's around these things, as someone who knows these prophecies and is talking to the scholars and all this, I think it's not just political jealousy, which we know he's certainly not above. He killed many of his own children and other relatives for fear that they would challenge his political power. But he goes to the priests and he lets them quote directly from Old Testament and these messianic hopes. I think Herod knows fully well who is promised a king from God himself who is going to change everything. And knowing full well who he is, he would rather keep his power. He would rather keep things as they are, even if he is kind of a lackey king to the Roman government, than let God overturn everything. We heard in Mary's song in Luke that the poor peasants, and as we're going to see later on in this gospel and others, tax collectors, prostitutes, the poor, the destitute, they're not going to have a problem, God, flipping things on their head. It's people like Herod who do. And so Herod's act of trying to hunt down Jesus, of trying to kill him, is not just a political move. He is actively opposing God's reordering of all of human society and stuff. It's an audacious, it's a scary thing, but I think we need to recognize this is a piece of the world and the reception that Jesus is going to have right from the get go. He's going to be hunted. God and his presence among us is going to be opposed. And that's an important part of this story. He's going to go on to slaughter other people on Jesus' behalf, and Jesus only survives by God's divine intervention, by becoming a refugee and growing up in not his own homeland, but in Egypt, right? And so I think an important part of this story is the injustice, the cruelty of the world, the opposition that the world and power are often going to have to God and his Messiah, and that's an important part of this story as well. That Jesus Jesus' presence in the world is also opposed. So, kind of just quickly, a few things I think that this section in the Magi can teach us. One is, again, I think we live in a world just like they did back then that is desperately seeking out God and truth, but they are going about it in ways that may or may not actually lead them to God. I think there's some reasons for that historically. There's some reasons that people who want spiritual depth are not going to traditional Christianity. And yet, I don't think that kind of hangover we have from history and places of power we've had in Western civilization is going to stop God, right? These these magi recognize the dream and the hope when the entire world will be gathered again into God's presence, and they find this king, they find this Messiah, not by studying good theology and kind of in a roundabout way of doing their own way of approaching God and spirituality, and then they find the real thing. So I think we need to be more open to this than we maybe traditionally have been. God is speaking, and his longing to teach them is a reminder that the gospel is always meant for outsiders. The gospel is always meant to invite outsiders in, whether that is the least, the poor, the unvalued, as we saw in Luke, whether that is those who are on different paths than ours. The gospel is always meant to invite people in. And I think there's a warning there as well that, who was it that understood who Jesus was and celebrated his presence? It was these outsiders. It's Gentiles. It's the least of society. It's the outcasts. And who is it that are opposing him? It's the good religious folk with the training, with the intellectual background, with the practices that is supposed to have prepared them for God's presence. And so I think the warning and the call is still there, right? We need to follow God well, even when he catches us off guard, even when he comes into the world. We need to be part of his overall invitation to all come to the table. God is among us. God is in the process of healing and making all things right. And so this Advent, I think the invitation is there again. Let's not keep this as head knowledge that applies in no way, shape, or form to our lives. Let's look around us and see where God is moving and stirring hearts to come toward him. Let's be part of catalyzing this in people's lives rather than opposing what God is up to, as sadly we as good religious folks have historically done so many times. So let's also respond to this invitation, and let's extend that invitation to loving God and loving others this Advent.